if political elites and media elites and academic elites and all of these people are so easily hoodwinked by this political movement to the extent that they will deny the truth of their own eyes and ears and deny the most basic biological distinction between human beings, recognize universally, every culture knows that there are men and women, every culture knows how babies are made, right? If our elites are willing to ignore that in order to repeat politically fashionable platitudes and then change their tune as soon as, the winds change and I think that's really disturbing. And the thing that I say to people is, if they are wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? If you take that simplistic view of history, then your starting point is that our ancestors were bad and stupid, right? That's the very strong tenet of the ideology, that what people thought in the past was necessarily wrong because they thought it in the past. This is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. One of the best pieces of evidence for Christianity being true, I think, is how much damage de-Christianization has done. I think that if Christianity is true, then that's exactly what you would expect to happen, that people would not cope with losing it, and that finding it again would cause cultural regeneration.
Louise, thank you so much for joining us again. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
The UK Supreme Court has just unanimously, that's significant in itself, ruled that the meaning of woman is to be defined by biological sex. I'd be very interested in any light you can show on it, particularly for those of us in Australia who've not really heard much about this. Is a very, very significant ruling indeed, as to how it came about and what you think it might mean.
I think the main thing that it signifies is a political and a social victory, in the sense that it remains to be seen exactly what effect this is going to have legislatively. It is a very important legislative decision, and more so than any other. There have been various legal cases relating to the trans question in recent years, but this is the most, the Supreme Court, as the name suggests, is the most senior court, and what they have ruled is that the word woman in the Equality Act, it has a biological meaning, not a socially constructed meaning, and that has ramifications all the way down the chain in terms of case law and so on, right? So this is very important. But I think that what it really marks for me is the enormous success of the gender critical feminist movement in being so persistent in pushing on this issue and facing so much social opprobrium, and people have lost jobs, people have lost so many friendships. I mean, the personal and professional costs are enormous for people involved in this. But I think this has finally marked a moment of vindication. One of the things that we've seen in Britain, I wonder if this is true in Australia as well, maybe, is that actually if you look at polling on what the general public think about the transgenderism over time, say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, people were actually better disposed towards this because they thought of it as just being nice to people who were different, kind of like being, it kind of being like homophobia, maybe people just need to be more tolerant. That was the vague view from a public who didn't really know much about this. And then actually over time, people have hardened against the trans movement. And I think that's because the demands of trans activists have been so extreme, and it's become clearer over time just how extreme they are. And people have, when they've encountered this, they've thought, oh, hang on, now this is a bit crazy. Are we really claiming that a woman is anyone who says they're a woman? Are we really claiming that there shouldn't be any such thing as a female-only space? Do we eat photos of, obviously male athletes towering over obviously female athletes within the women's category have been seen worldwide. So I think that the trans movement asked too much of the public. It asked for people to deny the truth of their own eyes and ears. And at long last, at least in Britain and hopefully elsewhere too soon, that has been repudiated.
What does it say about political leadership when your Prime Minister in Great Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, welcomes this decision for its clarity, yet he is somebody who is on the record as having said that it is wrong to say that, quote, only women have a cervix? How do we get to the point where there's a lack of clarity amongst those who lead us such that an issue like this has to be resolved by the courts? Because I think you've just alluded to it. The overreach was always going to end in tears on this one. You only have to talk to people in the streets. I know that sounds anecdotal, but the reality is that this overreach was incredibly damaging, I would have thought, to a lot of people.
Look, the human brain is extremely good at clocking the differences between men and women because there are so many different ways in which our bodies differ. Everything from how long your forearms are to how big your feet are to the shape of your hairline to the strength of your brow, your jawline, everything. There are so many different indicators of biological sex. It's actually very rare for a trans person to really pass. Particularly in person, like staged photos is one thing, but in person, the human brain is just so good at immediately clocking someone's sex. I think that a political movement that depends on people rejecting that instinct is a political movement that is doomed to fail. And the thing that I have found most disturbing about this political phenomenon, right, worldwide, is people like Keir Starmer, who, as you say, was a few years ago saying, you can't say that women have a cervix, and has now spun on a sixpence because of this ruling. I mean, I think what's going on there is that Keir Starmer has this view of as a former lawyer, a human rights lawyer at that, has a view of the courts that they just speak the truth, and whatever legal authority says must be true. And I find that disturbing, right? If political elites and media elites and academic elites and all of these people are so easily hoodwinked by this political movement to the extent that they will deny the truth of their own eyes and ears and deny the most basic biological distinction between human beings, recognize universally, every culture knows that there are men and women, every culture knows how babies are made, right? If our elites are willing to ignore that in order to repeat politically fashionable platitudes and then change their tune as soon as, the winds change I think that's really disturbing. And it makes me think, and this is what I say to progressive friends, like it's quite common for gender critical people to be otherwise progressive, to basically think that the trans thing is crazy, but actually on everything else, surely the progressive position is true. And the thing that I say to people is, if they are wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? If they can be wrong about something so fundamental, and if they can say something such obviously false things without blinking, what else is going on? And for me, this was very important in my political journey, because when I went to a very left-wing university and I was raised in a vaguely kind of secular lefty culture and family setting, and I moved away from that primarily because at university I encountered transgenderism in its fully fledged crazy form. And I thought, no, this isn't right. And it really was the first domino, in the sense that it set me thinking, oh, hang on, if this is wrong, what else is wrong? And I would really encourage, I think I'm so glad that at least in Britain, the most insane manifestation of this movement has now been, I think is now ended. I hope so. But that's not it, right? It's just the most outrageous manifestation of a larger ideology, which I think is causing so much damage, and which I think we need to start thinking seriously now about what else they're wrong about.
I think that's a very valuable insight. Let's pursue that for a moment, because it does seem to me that there is a sort of an extraordinary judgmentalism from many progressives if you disagree with any part of the progressive creed. It's all or nothing. It's a whole catechism. You've got to believe in it all.
Yeah.
I think you've made the very interesting observation elsewhere, I think it might have been when you were out here in Australia, that the term progressive you think's more useful than simply woke or trendy or whatever woke happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be interested in why you think that, because without wanting to preempt that, your perspective on this, it does rather seem to me that I think we've got to say that progressivism has failed. Its wreckage is all around us. Our societies are divided, distrustful. They are in a mess. And we've got to recognise, I think, the very point that you made. If they're wrong in part, there may be a great deal more they're wrong about as well.
Mm. The reason I tend not to use the word woke is because it's very obviously pejorative, and I tend to think that it wasn't originally. So the funny thing about this word is it was originally Black American slang, which was a good, considered to be a good thing. So that being woke was being kind of aware of politics in a good way, and then over time it's become pejorative. And so the reason I tend not to use it is because I prefer not to use terms that people would not use about themselves. Whereas progressive, people will happily call themselves progressive, and progressive is widely taken to be just an obviously good thing. Why would you not want to be progressive? I think it also contains a lot of, there's an important description of what the ideology actually is, in that it's this idea of history having a very clear linear shape, so that over time things get better and better. That is really central to the ideology. And it enables, if you take that simplistic view of history, then your starting point is that our ancestors were bad and stupid. Right? That's the very strong tenet of the ideology, that what people thought in the past was necessarily wrong because they thought it in the past. This is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery.
Yes.
Right, which is a great term. So that's very fundamental to the ideology. The other thing that's very fundamental to the ideology is a belief in the interchangeability of humans. So when it comes to trans, for instance, that men and women are not fundamentally different beings, that men and women are psychologically indistinguishable, and actually can be physically indistinguishable if only you try hard enough and use enough medical science and ignore the instinct to immediately recognize the difference between male and female bodies. It's what Steven Pinker famously decades ago described as the blank slate view of human nature, that people are just the same, and the only thing that makes us different is our environments, our social experiences, which can obviously be overwritten. This doesn't just apply to men and women, it applies to people from different countries, people with different, like the very idea that people might be born with different predispositions, different personalities, different abilities. I write mostly about the differences between men and women, which are profound and very interesting. Obviously, there are outliers, but it is just straightforwardly the case that men and women have different personalities on average, different preferences on average, and so on. This is all taboo within the progressive worldview. So the ideology is built on the idea that people are actually fundamentally exactly the same. And if you think that, then your policy prescriptions are going to be wrong, because your fundamental premise is wrong. I think that this is really the core mistake that's made by the ideology, and it's led to so many other mistakes, which I think we're seeing playing out more or less catastrophically across all the places where this ideology has taken hold.
It often seems to me that the old definitions of left and right, they're still bandied around in the mainstream media in relation to politics, are largely irrelevant. The division now seems to be between those of a progressive mindset, who, if I may say so, are very often very strong on emotions, versus those who think that clear thinking, evidence-based decision-making, an awareness of history, that history is a great teacher, the divisions seem to be quite different now, and the culture wars are starting to reflect it. But massive damage has been done. I find myself amazed at the state of modern Britain as somebody not wanting to be critical of your country at all. Well, I know that you're Australian as much as you are English, but it's not working out very well at all, it seems to me. And do you think with this sort of judgment from the Supreme Court, you are seeing a righting of the ship? I mean, you've seen the whole, the Cass report, a Labor government in your country has banned puberty blockers, as I understand it, in all but the most exceptional circumstances. You've seen a closing down of transgender clinics. None of us wish people who are struggling with these issues anything other than the best possible. But it's this overreach, this ideological obsession based on emotionalism that just seems to be destroying everything, including our economic prosperity and opportunities for young people.
A friend of mine has described the trans phenomenon as the this horse is my greatest general stage of civilizational decline, right? In the sense that it's just the most outrageous example of madness, but it's not by any means the only problem facing us. I think that what happened with trans is that almost no one actually bought into the claims of the movement. As I keep saying, no one can override their brain's instinct to recognize biological sex accurately. And I would be absolutely astonished if someone like Keir Starmer ever actually believed in any of this stuff. I think the reason that people signed up to it was because they wanted to be nice to a vulnerable group. And I mean, actually, there are some trans people who have said really interesting things on exactly this point. The psychological vulnerability that is inherent to transitioning. Andrea Long Chu, who's a trans writer, a very good writer, has said that trans people by transitioning become structurally dependent on the generosity of strangers. That's the expression, meaning that for the rest of your life, if you don't pass, which the vast majority of trans people don't, you go around dependent on other people being polite and affirming your chosen gender rather than recognizing your biological sex. And the problem with living that way is that some people won't do that. And that's not necessarily because they're bigots. It might be because they're children. It might be because they are elderly people with dementia or people with autism, or, you know, there are so many reasons why someone might not realize that if you see a man who is wearing a dress, you ought to call that person she. And if you will just psychologically dissolve if someone doesn't use the word she around you, then you are permanently in a state of distress, inevitably. And I feel so sorry for people who bought into the claims of the trans movement and were permanently medically altered by doctors who ought to face legal consequences for their actions, probably won't, but ought to, and are now in a situation where they're kind of intersex because their doctors have made them intersex. They've been permanently biologically altered, and they have to face for the rest of their lives this being in this uncanny position where people don't quite know how to respond to them, which causes such social distress and psychological distress. And the people like Keir Starmer, other progressives who signed up for this to support this movement, they did it because they thought they were being kind to those people. I think that actually they were doing the opposite. I think they were actually encouraging people to harm themselves in a way that caused them permanent harm, that they thought that they were being kind. And they thought that by repeating untruths and what's more, coercing the public into repeating untruths was a way of being compassionate. And what's more of, because this is so inherent to progressivism, I think, as an ideology, of rejecting the truisms of the past, are saying the traditional view of gender is false. The Christian view of gender is false because de-Christianization is also a very important component of progressivism. It scratched ideological itches for them and it made them feel good about themselves because they thought they were being nice. They weren't being nice. They were causing a lot of harm. But I think this is the instinct which has caused so much damage. And by the way, I mean, talking of, there are so many examples of this, of the state enforcing the completely false claim that a woman is whoever identifies as a woman, right? But the one for me that really jumps out, I think this was from 2020 in North Wales, was a time when an autistic teenage boy was out in public shopping or something and saw a police community support officer who is trans and who doesn't pass, and said loudly, this teenager, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And was convicted of a hate crime for saying this, and was given a heavy fine, and I think was placed under house arrest for a period. This is an autistic teenager who just expressed sincere confusion when encountering someone who is confusing because they don't look like, like this is the nature of the phenomenon, right? And the state persecuted that person. And there are lots of other instances of this. For me, this is the one that just really jumps out. And used the nature of what policing is it's using the threat of state violence in order to enforce conformity with the law. And the law was, hopefully no longer is, this kind of remains to be seen, but the law was that you had to you had to deny the truth of your own eyes at risk of state persecution. I just think this is madness. And I think that the people who signed up for this and supported it because they thought they were being nice, just didn't think. I think there's just a moment of blind stupidity among our elites, which really ought to make us question the fallibility of our elites.
I heard someone quip once that just because I say no doesn't mean I don't love you. Indeed, it may be precisely because I do love you. There are times when I think we do people a great disservice by not telling them the truth. I was astonished to learn. I knew, for example, that one of the great problems for young girls who are thinking of transitioning is that they're really told or really fully understand that it almost certainly means that they'll never have children. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that amazed me, I recently learned, they're never told that they're never likely, very unlikely to be able to have satisfactory sexual lives as well. And so that incredible intimacy that's so powerful and so binding for so many people in relationships when it's used wisely is something that's going to be denied to many people who take on at a young age the processes of transgenderism or of transiting.
It's a medical scandal on a par with the lobotomy scandal, I think, in terms of the harm it has caused, the lies that were told, the suppression of medical investigation and medical evidence, the persecution of dissidents. It's just, unfortunately, these things do recur in history, and this sort of mass hysteria enabled by certain the fact that it was ideologically convenient for various reasons, yes, led to this disaster.
No one wishes any harm on people who are struggling with real issues. And the court, it's important, I think, to note, I'd be interested in your views on this, at the same time as they determined that the meaning of woman is to be defined by biological sex, so assured trans-identifying people that they were still protected against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and harassment in substance in their acquired gender. That sounds reasonable. Have they got it right, or have they inadvertently perhaps opened up further Pandora's boxes here?
It's an inherently difficult question because women are afforded certain privileges in law that men are not, because there is the recognition that women are physically vulnerable in a way that men are not, and that women are much less likely to be violent than are men. So women having their own prisons, for instance, is a privilege afforded in law, by which I don't mean that it's a highly deserved privilege, and it was one that was fought for in, I think it was the late 18th century, that this became a rallying cry for feminists, because women didn't used to have their own prisons. I mean, prisons obviously used to be different, but women didn't used to have this protection within the prison service, which protected them from violence, and particularly from sexual violence. This also applies to other things as well. You know, women having their own. In the 19th century, women wanting to have their own toilet facilities in public was again a source of feminist agitation, because it used to be that when women couldn't go to the toilet publicly, they were tied to the home. This is one of the reasons why department stores became popular with women early on, because it was a way of going shopping but knowing that you had a safe private women's toilet available to you out and about, right? So there's a hundreds of years history of women wanting to have certain protected spaces in public for their own safety and dignity. How do you protect those spaces without having a clear definition of what a woman is? So it's straightforward to say that trans people, like everybody, shouldn't be vulnerable to public harassment or to violence, and that the police ought to take any such harassment or violence incredibly seriously, that people shouldn't be, I don't know, evicted from their homes because they're trans or because they're gay, or, but you know, that on that point we're fine. I think everyone is in agreement that trans people ought to be protected in that way. The question is, though, whether trans people should have access to these spaces that have historically been reserved for women, or whether there should be. I mean, the argument from gender critical feminists has never been, maybe in very marginal cases, but in general has never been that trans people ought to be forced to share spaces with men because of the recognition that that would make them vulnerable to harassment and assault. The argument has always been for third spaces, for having gender-neutral bathrooms alongside men's and women's bathrooms, or having separate wings of prisons or of hospitals or whatever it might be, which are for like a third category of people who don't fit neatly into either box. That's always been the argument. And that ends up it protects the safety and dignity of trans people. What it doesn't is affirm their ideas about their own gender. And that's why it's being resisted by trans activists. I very much hope that the third space strategy will be the one that's adopted. We've already, it's already the case that disabled toilets ought to be available, for instance. We've already accepted that there needs to be that kind of provision in public spaces. Why not make disabled toilets also third spaces in terms of gender or habitation? This practical problem is completely solvable. What isn't solvable is the demand that we must affirm what people say about their own gender at all times, regardless of the impact that it has on women and girls. And I think that's where the conflict lies. And I think that in the end, the gender critical view has won out and will inevitably win out, because the trans position is just too crazy. And I know that this is still an ongoing issue in Australia, very much so. I'm confident, though, that once the public get to know trans activism, right, once it becomes clear quite how radical these claims are, that this isn't just about being vaguely nice to a vulnerable group, but this is about fundamentally a fundamental assault on reality and sanctioned by the state. I think that once Australians recognise that I'm sure that the public opinion will swing in exactly the same way that it has in Britain.
I have little doubt about where the
ballast lies in terms of what people in the community feel about this stuff. They see it as overreach, as we've discussed, and they're baffled by it and wondering why so few of their political leaders can tell up from down. It is extraordinary. And talking of how hard it is to understand modern takes on situations, the left-wing Guardian wrote of your book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, that your ideas could be, quote, hardly more radical. How does it come about? And I know we've all talked about this quite a bit and we've all wondered it, including at conferences like ARC that you've spoken at, where that which was so accepted, so unquestioned for so much of human history, and indeed so broadly in the world today, is now seen as somehow or other radical to disagree with or to challenge. How does this happen so quickly?
Yeah. I think this is the great question of our age, to which there isn't one easy answer. I think part of the story, although this invites more questions still, is to do with de-Christianization. So Tom Holland, I'm sure listeners are aware of, has said that the 1960s ought to be understood as a second Reformation. Not just the 1960s, you know, the social change symbolized by the 1960s is as radical as the first Reformation, except that if the first Reformation was a rejection of Catholicism, then the second Reformation is a rejection of Christianity per se. Tom and I disagree on this slightly. He thinks that we've transitioned to a different type of Christianity, that progressivism is actually a new branch of Christianity. I tend to disagree. I think that it's more of a heretical rejection. I mean, it clings on to some Christian ideas, but I think that you can't really describe progressivism as Christianity because it's avowedly atheistic. It has absolutely nothing to say on Jesus Christ. It, it rejects every church institution imaginable, etc. It basically holds on to just a few philosophical ideas that have been born from Christianity and perverts them. But anyway, that shift away from Orthodox Christianity, let's say, Orthodox with a small O, is so profound historically, and I think what's caused it is an additional question, right? But I think that we can confidently say that it has caused a lot of political and psychological turmoil, and that actually one of the things that we've learned, particularly from the last decade or two, is that people don't cope very well without religion, and that the expectation of the new atheism movement that actually we would just smoothly transition away from old superstitions and towards a new enlightened view and, greater rationality and so on is not true. What's happened is that people have started treating politics more like religion, and have also experienced all sorts of social and psychological disorders, from epidemics of loneliness and of atomization and meaninglessness, and an incredibly high proportion of people in Western countries taking antidepressants and being diagnosed with mental illness. I mean, there are just so many ways in which people are clearly not coping very well without Christianity. And I think that must be a very big part of why people have latched on to some of these really insane ideas. Transgenderism being one of the most obvious examples, where they don't have any kind of grounding in a long-standing and durable worldview, and in fact feel that anything that our ancestors thought is inherently suspect and ought to be deconstructed, challenged, rebelled against, etc. I think that that's a very big part of why we're seeing this this sort of spiraling politically, and why exactly this has happened. I mean, My strong suspicion is it probably has something to do with technology. So my first book was largely about the effect that the contraceptive pill had on society, this sort of technological shock. But the pill wasn't the only thing that happened in the mid-20th century and since. There's obviously been so many ways in which our lives have been materially changed by technology. My strong suspicion is that is probably what's going on with the ideological changes that we've seen more broadly. But it maybe we're too close to tell. It may be the historians have to answer this question for us in the future.
Churchill was a great historian. He always said if you want to see into the future, look to the past. And he wrote in 1933, and it's important to remember that he was not a Christian in the sense of believing in the metaphysical. But he was, I think, a civilizational Christian, if I can put it that way. He saw what Western freedoms, and particularly British freedoms, owed to Christianity. And he wrote that when a culture stops passing on the stories of its heroes and its religious faith, young people are left without a sense of place and purpose and direction, and open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people who don't know their history are easily persuaded. Interesting words. It seems to me that the things we've been talking about, people have suspended credibility. They've suspended critical thinking. Perhaps they've never been taught what critical thinking was. And so you get the G.K. Chesterton thing, and Churchill himself referring to pretty much the same thing. When we stop believing in our traditional faith, it's not that we believe in nothing. We end up believing in anything.
Yeah. And this is it's a really mysterious and interesting process. Interesting only if you step back and stop, forget how dramatically this affects all of our own lives. But I'm really interested in the ways in which British people specifically have been the creators of progressive ideology, and I mean the greater British diaspora, right? That there are 200 million British descended people living outside of Britain, right? Primarily in America and Australia and Canada and so on, and it's those countries and British descended people in those countries who've really created this ideology. Primarily, if you look at sort of the key proponents and the people who've seized onto it most enthusiastically and who've pushed it hardest, it has its manifestations in other parts of Europe and so on, but really the rest of the world is kind of immune to this weirdness, right? And it really interests me, what is it about, and I say this as someone who's descended from my family are Australian but of British descent, so I have a foot in both camps, both countries. And what is it about British people that has generated this self-loathing? I mean, a group that has possibly contributed more to scientific discovery and to, the British basically invented the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happened first in Britain. I mean, the long list of things that were created by the British diaspora, everything from air travel to antibiotics, right? To have then thrown ourselves into an ideology which repudiates all of that. I mean, doesn't strictly repudiate air travel and antibiotics. It comes pretty close, but basically regards everything done by our ancestors as suspect and everything about our societies as cursed in some way. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating. You'll hear basically exactly those sentiments uttered on every Anglophone university campus, right? This is a great mystery to me. Like, why have we done this to ourselves? It's not everyone, clearly. If there are plenty of, normal people. The man on the club omnibus, right, doesn't tend to think this way, although he's been fairly successfully propagandized. But in terms of our elite culture coming out of universities and politics and media and so on, in the space of a really short period of time, less than 100 years, we've come to despise ourselves. I don't know why.
It is indeed extraordinary. It seems to me that we demean ourselves, we belittle ourselves, we become pygmies when we refuse to recognise the heroism and the sacrifices that those who have gone before us have made in order that we could enjoy common law, the right to vote, the ability to change governments without having to pull out a gun. You do it at the point of a pencil instead. And I wonder whether, in fact, this has not been the crowning success, in a way, of those who sought to educate our children, has been to deprive them of any understanding of their history and therefore their sense of place, their sense of, if you don't know anything about the real heroes who have gone before us, you can't understand how the dangerous of the times have been. They may come again. In fact, I would say we need heroes now, but we've washed out of our culture any understanding of what a hero is, so we don't recognise the qualities of a hero. And that really shows up, I think, in our politics, because we look not for heroes, but for people who will pat us on the back and play to the lowest common denominator rather than stretch us.
Yeah, but what records we have suggest that late Rome had a similar sort of nervous breakdown. So there might be something to do with collapsing empires, which induces this psychological dysphoria in people. I wonder if it's also to do with affluence to some extent. I think that it can be quite easy to kid yourself that human nature isn't real, which is a tenet of progressivism, right? If you live a very sheltered life and if you don't tend to interact with humanity at its worst, and you're not really worrying about your ability to feed yourself and your children, maybe affluence generates some of these psychological phenomena. I don't know, but it clearly has occurred at the same time as the loss of the British Empire and the loss of Anglophone dominance in the world. I'm sure that, your standard academic who hates everything that the British Empire stands for would not concede that they are suffering from psychological collapse as a result of the loss of empire. But I note that the fact that these things kind of happen simultaneously. I don't know. I wish I could offer clear answers on this because I find it very mysterious. But I think that you can't help you. I had this conversation recently with a friend of mine who's an architectural historian, and we were talking about the fact that architecture after the end of the Second World War is just so much worse. It's just so much worse. It's like objectively worse. In the sense that if you ask people which buildings do you find beautiful, they don't like brutalism. They don't like the houses built in the domestic houses built in 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s beyond are just worse than older houses. And there's a lot going on there, as experts in architecture will tell you, in terms of loss of ornamentation, loss of symmetry, all sorts of things. A lot of it is to do with rejecting traditional ideas about architecture, the belief that actually if you could subverting those ideas is a good thing, that subversion per se is a good thing. And so architects are reluctant to just imitate the forms of the past because they think that that's low status in some way. So there's a lot going on there. But the point that my friend made, which I think is so true, is that in the end, you just kind of have to get into a fundamentally spiritual investigation of why did people decide that the beauty of the past wasn't good anymore? Why did they decide to reject the wisdom of their ancestors when it came to our architecture and many other things? And yeah, there is something spiritual there. It's something to do with a sort of cultural dysphoria, which is being experienced particularly in the Anglosphere.
I'd like to come back in a moment to something that gives me great hope, which is that it seems to me that there are many younger people who are starting to really understand how mad all this has been. But before we do, and talking of madness, I'm old enough to remember when the great cat's cry in the early days of the sexual revolution was get government out of the bedroom. You know, get everybody out of the bedroom except consenting adults. Now, the wheels turn completely. In Australia, we have endless taxpayer-funded ads explaining to us how to manage the issue of consent.
Yeah, I saw those when I was in Australia.
I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a complete revolution. I mean, I know I'm not young anymore, but in my lifetime, I've seen this complete revolution. Get government out of the bedroom. Now, government's right in our bedroom, telling us how to conduct relationships. And as a side note, I can't help noting that there's a lot of research around telling us that we're less satisfied than ever with our sexual lives anyway. It's not exactly paying out well. You've actually been a critic of the consent view, I think, of virtuous sex, consent view in inverted commas. The prevailing wisdom, I suppose, even people would say it's common sense. If it's consensual, it's fine. But I think you would say, well, it's not actually working out that way.
Yeah, so the consent principle in such relationships just doesn't work. So the idea is that as long as everyone is consenting, it's fine. The problem with that view is that there are so many instances of that not really working. You know, if someone, so we can say, okay, so children can't consent to sex, fine, therefore pedophilia is forbidden. But what about AI child porn, right? What about adults dressing up as children and deliberately imitating children in order to sexually attract other adults? You know, there are so many instances of this which feel instinctively appalling, and that the vast majority of people would immediately be revolted by, but which do technically jump the consent hurdle, right? The consent hurdle also just invites so many other issues to do it. You know, what if a 16-year-old girl, so she's technically legal, but what if the 16-year-old girl has a terrible mental health and is incredibly gullible, is incredibly vulnerable to persuasion by malicious adults, is very unworldly, very unintelligent? I mean, are we really going to say that girl can have sex with as many people as she wants, can, when she turns 18, can appear in porn, you know, like that? It doesn't pass the intuition test, the consent framework. And I think because it doesn't pass the intuition test, because it's obviously not fit for purpose as the sole moral question concerning all of sexual relationships, which are incredibly complicated. I mean, every culture has very complicated norms and laws surrounding sexual relationships, because it's how a society reproduces itself. Like, sexual reproduction is the way that a society continues, and it's everybody's business. Who, you know, if particularly in the age before contraception, if a young woman gets pregnant by some bozo, right, in really bad circumstances, it affects her life. It affects the rest of her life. It affects her family's life. It affects her community's life. This is highly, highly consequential stuff. So obviously societies have always come up with elaborate ways of managing sexual relationships. We are alone in being hubristic enough to think that we can just have the consent model and everything will be fine. And I think that hubris comes from the invention of reliable contraception, you know, as I explained in the case against the sexual revolution. It's apparent that this doesn't really work. And I think that what you're seeing with, say, it was funny you mentioned the consent ads. When we were in Australia recently and we flew in Qantas, and as soon as we entered Australian airspace, I started getting these government ads, because you get Wi-Fi on planes now, right? I started getting these government ads for, like, teaching me about consent. It was very peculiar. And then, of course, we got a land acknowledgement when we landed and everything. Anyway, you know, welcome to Australia. The government has become more interfering, and you've had these sort of new, because the consent model doesn't work, you've seen people scrambling to try and assemble some other kind of framework that will protect against sexual harm. And sometimes these can be actually more restrictive and authoritarian than the former ones. So, for instance, it's common for age gap discourse is a long-running thing on social media, where feminists will be very condemnatory of even quite small age gaps, like relatively small age gaps between men and women, and regarding these as being exploitative or whatever. I think often these are quite implausible, these arguments, but you end up, because the consent framework doesn't work, you end up layering on top of it all sorts of sort of improvised new moral ideas around sexuality, which are not agreed universally and have not proved to be durable over time, which have basically been invented and jotted down on the back of an envelope, right? And things like, I mean, it is so apparent to everybody that sexual violence continues, despite the fact that we supposedly live in a utopian post-sexual revolution setting, right? And one of the observations that Christopher Lasch, the theorist, made many years ago, which is so true, is that as other institutions that govern morality retreat, as the family retreats, we've become more atomized, and the extended family has become much weaker. As the church retreats, obviously we've already spoken about dechristianization, there's this gap. There is no institution there to provide guidance on, for instance, sexual relationships. And so the government steps into the breach. And so the story of the 20th and 21st centuries is the government becoming ever, ever larger and more intrusive and taking on more of the roles that were used to be performed by the church and by the family. And which includes trying to govern sexual morality, not just when it comes to enforcing the law on rape, but actually trying to intrude into the bedroom, as you say, and teach young people. I mean, state education is also part of this as well, right? The state is literally now responsible for educating our children. Teach young people the new framework, but the new framework isn't fit for purpose because the consent model isn't fit for purpose. And so you just end up with this sort of disintegration.
Well, I suspect we'd both be in furious agreement that actually I don't want my children socialised by big brother government. It's the last thing I've never seen a government that's been any good at it.
Yeah.
It should be downstream of people, not and a functioning society, not upstream of it. So that begs the obvious question. You're raising a little one. I'm watching my own children raise children and my grandchildren, and that's a wonderful experience. But what advice can we offer them about the minefield of relationship convulsions that they're going to go into? Because they are. That's the society that's been created. And I guess it sounds incredibly radical, but it does rather seem to me, to be frank, that maybe the Christians had it right.
Yeah. I'm raising two little ones. We had another baby recently. So yes. And they are, we think about this so much, me and my husband, how do we raise them to be inoculated against some of the most destructive phenomena that we see all around us. And yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I was not raised Christian. Up until my early 20s, I was basically signed up to most progressive ideas. But I have ended up concluding, sort of from first principles, that actually the Christian worldview, including Christian sexual morality, is really the best we have, pretty much. And I certainly don't think that the status quo is preferable. And for all of the trade-offs, of which there are many, I think that a system of morality that withstood nearly 2,000 years and led to the creation of some of the most impressive civilizational achievements of human history has a lot going for it and is clearly capable of encouraging human flourishing in a way that our current improvised and obviously deeply flawed system of morality isn't, because it's already evident that the spirit of the 1960s has caused a lot of harm. I think it's already evident that it's not working. We've run the experiment, and already it's creating terrible problems and all sorts of unsustainable. It seems so clear to me that this experiment has failed, and so if that's the case, we can't. I think the error of progressivism and of leftism in general is to think that you can design society from the ground up, that you can do away with all of the silly old conventional wisdom and you can just design it anew. And it's also one of the rhetorical advantages that progressives have, that they never have to say, what they can offer is some future scenario where everything is good and where we've won and we have our new utopian society, which leaves no space for human nature, right? But which I promise you, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. Whereas what the conservatives have to do is to reject that fantasy and say, let's look at societies that have actually existed and have actually worked, and let's look at what they got right, and let's try and implement it in our own societies. And of course, the problem with doing that is you end up having to confront the baseness of humans, and the fact that there are always trade-offs. There is always sadness and disappointment and difficulty in every era, in every society. There are always problems. But I think that what we actually have to choose from are real societies that have actually existed and have actually functioned, not this fantasy in the future. I think that the fantasy is very deceptive and politically pernicious. And I think, maybe there is some scenario where you can successfully manage human sexual relationships without anyone ever feeling any sadness and without anything ever going wrong. I don't think it's very plausible, though. I think that what's more likely is that we have to basically choose from the, as Churchill said, democracy is the least worst option. I think that also comes to Christian sexual morality and the Christian worldview in general. The question then is, do you have to sign up to the whole package? Do you have to believe as well? And is it possible to sustain a society that has basically a Christian worldview without anything upstairs, without actually believing? And I don't know if that's the case, and I guess we'll just have to find out.
It's an interesting one, Louise, and I noticed, I thought it was incredibly honest and an interesting thing for you to say. I think you said that you found you'd come to the point where Christianity was both emotionally and intellectually extremely appealing for you, but you weren't so sure on the metaphysical. You made the comment a moment ago, I'm paraphrasing here, but in essence that the Christian way in relation to the way you carry forward your sexual life is not necessarily an easy one. It involves trade-offs and some downsides, but on balance it wins. It may be the better way to do it. It raises the question, I think you've just alluded to it, as to whether it's enough to find something emotionally and intellectually appealing, or whether you need the power of actually believing in a deity who's engaged in our lives personally. You may or may not want to comment on that, but it's just to spell out that dilemma, I think. I have people say to me, do I actually have to personally believe? I can see that Christianity's been important to our culture. It's the Churchill position, really. And that the loss of it has been very important, but I can't buy into the idea of the spiritual side of it as much as I can the emotional and intellectual. I wonder in the end whether the power to make those sacrifices, if you like, to make the really tough choices to walk that relatively narrow and rocky path rather than the broad, easy highway can be done without a personal belief. That may be just a rhetorical question to sum up what I think you're alluding to, or you may care to comment. I certainly wouldn't want to put words into your mouth on something that's deep and personal for all of us, really.
I describe myself as a Christian agnostic, and I do. I go to church. I go to church mostly to take my children to church, and we intend to send them to a Christian school. And my husband and I are both sort of in the same position, that we are. We have the emotional and the intellectual attraction, but we don't quite believe. We're not sure. We're doubters. But we figure that maybe what we've experienced is a sort of cultural firebreak, where if you're not raised in a society where people believe by default, it's hard for you to believe yourself. But maybe what you can do is you can set up your children's lives such that it's easier for them to believe, because they're surrounded by people who do. And then maybe the firebreak is resolved and the children can be sincerely believing Christians. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I did read, interestingly, that this last Easter, church attendance across loads of countries was at record levels. And in France in particular, there's this incredible number of conversions, Catholic conversions took place on Easter Sunday. And there are people who've anticipated a Christian revival for a while now. I think it's quite possible that it's happening. And one of my other preoccupations, which I'm writing about at the moment, is the issue of birth rates. And one of the things that you do see quite clearly from the data on birth rates is that more religious people are having more children. It's not just a binary between believers and non-believers. It's the more you believe, the more you go to church, the more important your faith is to you, the more children you have. And given that religion is heritable, both in the sense that it seems to be a psychological quality that some people have to be more religious, and also that it's something that you're raised in. If you're raised in a religious faith, you're more likely to practice it as an adult. In both senses, religiosity is being selected for, and future generations are likely to be more religious. So I think it's very plausible that this secularization that we've experienced in our lifetimes is going to be a historical blip, and we're going to return to a more religious norm. And, I think it just in a purely rational sense, actually one of the best pieces of evidence for Christianity being true, I think, is how much damage de-Christianization has done. I think that if Christianity is true, then that's exactly what you would expect to happen, that people would not cope with losing it, and that finding it again would cause cultural regeneration.
I think it's wonderful when people of your thoughtfulness and powers of expression are able to flesh out what I think a lot of people are now starting to grapple with. Where do we find hope? And we've tried to pretend we can be, each of us, God over our own lives, and we haven't been up to the task. And people are asking big questions again, and I think that's to be welcomed. And so thank you for your honesty. Can I move on to something that's kind of downstream but related? How would you encourage your little ones, plural, congratulations, to think out how they would think about one another and the opposite sex, and how they relate to society in a world that's trying to pretend there's no differentiation? I remember back at university, a good friend of mine who was a very robust, manly sort of a fellow, opening the door of the Fisher Library at the University of Sydney for a young fellow student who was a female. And she spat at him and said, "Don't be a male chauvinist. Don't you dare open the door for me." And he was taken aback, because he thought that was a nice and decent and proper thing to do. He would have done it for his mother. His mother would have encouraged him to do it. and said that's a nice way to treat a young lady when you meet the right one. Are they really such out-of-date views, or are they the sorts of things that we ought to be encouraging again?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had all the answers on this. And I'll say this with the proviso that my children are currently 3 and 7 months. So I've not yet parented teenagers, and I'm sure people who've parented teenagers might say
that you'll be
this
thinking
is
about this.
been done. Yeah, indeed. Our plan, we have 2 little boys, is to send them to single-sex schools, to take them to church, to encourage a more... I mean, my view on the gender roles thing is I'm not rigid about it. I also think that you ought to go with the grain is my principle. That I think that given that there are significant average psychological differences between men and women, men will generally do better to follow the more traditionally masculine path, and women will generally do better to follow the traditionally more feminine path. There are obviously lots of options within those two camps. But I think that going with the grain on gender roles will generally produce greater happiness for everybody. So that's what we encourage at home. With the recognition. I mean, my eldest in particular, he's very stereotypically masculine in a lot of ways. Like, he loves trains more than anything, and he runs around like little boys do. He's very rambunctious, but he's also he's so sweet and loving and affectionate and sensitive. And, this is what boys are like. I'm not encouraging a caricatured vision of masculine femininity, not by any means. I also think that subversion for subversion's sake is a mistake and leads to unhappiness. So I think embracing masculine and feminine virtues, and then also recognizing the failure modes in both cases. So for boys, it's obviously the eternal question that all societies face. What do you do about excess male aggression? How do you channel male aggression and male libido in positive directions, not in destructive ones? Every society has to wrestle with this. What do you do about your young men who are simultaneously so energetic and productive and can do so much? It's young men who overwhelmingly historically have made new scientific discoveries and have been explorers and have done these amazing things. They're also dangerous and prone to crime and dysfunction. So what do you do about them? And that's not an easy question to answer, except that I think things like combat sports, male only spaces, like things like sports and cadets, and encouraging boys to do adventurous things, but for a good cause. I think these are all traditional ways of trying to raise boys in positive ways, which we intend to pursue. We haven't had any girls yet, so I guess if hopefully we do in the future, then we will have to develop our own complementary strategies.
Well, I certainly wish you all the best with it. I'll come back to fertility in a moment, but before I do, I must say, for me, it's staggering to learn that last year some research found that 70% of OnlyFans creator accounts were porn-based, and 84% of creators were women. We've always thought of pornography as something that affects men, or that men are more likely to consume pornography than women. But one American paper did the sums a couple of years ago and reported that 2% of American women aged between 18 and 45 are running OnlyFans creator accounts. What is it that leads modern and apparently liberated women to go down this particular track in life?
So at the societal level, it's the false ideas of sexual liberation offered by a lot of feminists, which I've written about at length, which tell women lies about the nature of sexual liberation and the desirability of foregoing monogamy and commitment and so on. I mean, this is all stuff that I've written about at length. I think on the personal level, I think it's vanity and impulsiveness that leads to such a high proportion of young women being on OnlyFans. I think that the vanity comes from the wish to be seen as attractive by men, and attracting male sexual attention gives a sort of sugar rush of excitement and self-esteem, which is particularly attractive if you are low on self-esteem. The impulsiveness comes from that OnlyFans is so often sold, I think falsely, as a means to make easy money. The vast majority of people on OnlyFans don't make much in the way of money at all. There's a very intense Pareto distribution on OnlyFans where most people make practically nothing, and then there are a few very high earners who make all the money and become famous, and obviously promoted by OnlyFans because that it invites more content creators to join the platform, so that they're given this promise of, oh, maybe you'll become vastly wealthy by doing this easy job. And a lot of people don't think about the long-term effects of that. I mean, I always say that OnlyFans is to the marriage market as a criminal record is to the jobs market. It becomes more difficult to attract a long-term partner if you've been on OnlyFans or if you've had any kind of involvement in the sex industry. It's not like you can never find a partner, but it just becomes much more difficult because a lot of men will find that deeply unappealing in a potential wife. And so maybe you're making some initial cash, probably not, but you're running very serious long-term risks in terms of your future relationships, and also in terms of things like what if photos get sent to your employer or to your family or your children or your grandchildren run across these in the future? I mean, the risks of embarrassment and sadness are so high for so little reward. But I think that it's a very good argument for why having social guardrails is a good thing, because in the past, no respectable woman would think of doing something like OnlyFans, being involved in the sex industry. I mean, the OnlyFans is worse than just prostitution because there's a permanent record of it. So the reputational risk is more enduring than in other ways that you can be involved in the sex industry in the past. No respectable woman would do such a thing because she would be so worried about running afoul of local opinion and of ruining her reputation. And I completely recognize that local opinion can be tyrannical, and falling afoul of, the local church ladies was a very serious and frightening thing for people because they could be very cruel. But the reason that exists, that the reason that you have these local enforcement of Christian moral ideas is precisely to prevent this sort of thing happening, to prevent young women from giving in to their vanity and their impulsivity and making decisions that potentially wreck their lives. And I think a functional society just wouldn't permit OnlyFans to exist.
When freedom becomes licentiousness, freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. There is a place, it seems to me, for taboos. It can be a very useful thing to know that there are societal norms and that you ought to respect them. The trouble is that many of the absolutist norms that are now applied by, dare I say, extreme feminists and so forth, the tripwires are just unbelievable, and the price you pay for offending them are extraordinary. But it does raise in my mind, where are feminists on issues like OnlyFans behaving in the way that we've been talking about? Is this really, to them, just a matter of female empowerment?
Well, feminists aren't of one mind on this. So regrettably, a large proportion, and particularly the mainstream proportion of feminists are far too relaxed about the sex industry and think that it's just a matter of female autonomy and women should be allowed to do what they want with their own bodies, sort of argument, which I think fails to grapple with the second order effects of this phenomenon. And falls back on making the error of thinking that just because something's consensual, it's good, which I think just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There are, of course, other women who are very critical of this. There have always been radical feminists have always been deeply critical of the sex industry. There is a new wave of feminist thinking. People like Mary Harrington, who's a friend of mine, Nina Power, another friend. There's a whole, I think, emerging school of thought which takes a different attitude towards these questions, and I think deserves the label feminist. I kind of half jokingly use Mary Harrington's term reactionary feminist to describe myself, and sometimes criticize, not so much for using the word reactionary, but for using the word feminist. But I think it's a word that's worth holding on to, because I'm genuinely very interested in and motivated to protect the interests of women as such, because the interests of women are different from the interests of men, and slightly. I mean, there are ways, of course, in which our interests are combined, but sometimes they're at odds slightly. And the nature really of women having children is that women are less likely to be found within the corridors of power. They always have been, and they were formerly excluded historically, and now are underrepresented. And specifically, it's mothers who are underrepresented, because having children, certainly for a short period, often for a long period, means that you just can't participate in public life in the way that you otherwise could. You have to retreat from public life. And there are so few mothers at the very top of political life. And it means inherently that women are less capable of making a case for their own interests, because they're not present in the rooms where these decisions are being made. And to my mind, that's why feminism exists, as a kind of counterweight to that phenomenon, so that there is a political movement that exists precisely to represent the interests of women. The problem is, of course, as we both know, a lot of feminists do precisely the opposite, and they endorse ideas which are actually deeply, deeply harmful for women. So I suppose that's kind of the role that I've taken on for myself, to try and argue against that. But from the starting point that I think that the goal of protecting women's interests is a good one.
As Warren Farrell puts it, if one sex is not doing well, the other isn't doing as well as it could either. And I understand exactly what you're saying. And I think of my three daughters, and they would be saying, Dad, don't say anti-feminist. And I didn't mean to at all. It's really this human tendency that we see in progressivism everywhere to overreach and to damage the very things you say you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think it's because, as we were talking about at the very beginning, the priors are wrong. If you start from two really crucial priors to progressivism. One is that people in the past were bad and wrong, right, by default, and two, that humans are interchangeable and psychologically identical, except and are formed solely through their social experiences. If you start from those priors, both of which are false, you can't help but generate false ideas and make people's lives worse. And I think that's why we need to challenge both of those priors if we're to improve politics.
You've been very, very generous and very insightful, and I thank you for that. There are two areas, though, that I, in wrapping up, drawing to a close, both unexpected, and I suspect in a way possibly related. The first is the West, but not only the West, is facing a fertility crisis. Suddenly, globally, nobody saw it coming. There's a depopulation bomb on its way, and Nicholas Eberstadt in the United States, I think I would represent him fairly when he would say that there's around 15 countries now in population freefall. And it includes places like China, Japan, Italy, South Korea, where there's no way of seeing that freefall actually being turned around. It is a freefall. And there are a number of other countries, including Australia, which will join that depopulation bomb in the next 10 years or so. We didn't see it coming. What is driving? There must be many factors, because it doesn't seem to be related to the type of government that you have. I mean, China is not a democracy. Japan is. Italy is. Some are prosperous, some are poor, but you've got this outside of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East. Populations are either stabilizing, as they're doing in India, or they're declining, or they're in free fall. What's driving this? That's a very big question, but you might have a couple of headline thoughts.
I wish that I could just revert to my usual hobby horses and blame the things that I like to blame for our social ills. I think that actually the birth rates question is bigger than that, and is because, as you say, it doesn't just affect, say, post-Christian countries or hyper-liberal countries or whatever. It affects it almost everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa. I think that the most plausible explanation for it, and it's not a very happy one, is that it's to do with affluence. That there seems to be a point at which people's lives become so comfortable that they are no longer inclined to reproduce, and that people are weirdly more eager to have children in conditions of scarcity and difficulty, which may be one of the things that explained the post-war baby boom, actually, in the West, that people had suffered during the Second World War, and that suffering ignited a desire to reproduce, which was then lost, which isn't a very happy thought, is it? Because it suggests that our affluent, cushy lives are, in a sense, unsustainable. I don't know. I mean, it's a very, very complicated sociological puzzle, and it's one of those that it tends to invite simplistic answers. So I don't want to offer a simplistic one, except that it seems like by some mechanism, affluence is the key driver of this.
I should be sensitive to your time. Louise, thank you so very much.